Hello there, this is Dr. Moyer. Welcome to your survey construction PowerPoint, where we will talk about how to create surveys. One of the reasons that you guys have to create surveys is because this is a quantitative statistics class, and we have to have numerical or quantitative data to analyze. Otherwise, I wouldn't limit you to a survey for any type of study, but for the purposes of this class, it's just easier if everyone does the same thing. So this isn't a comprehensive survey construction lecture, but hopefully it's enough to help you, along with the article I signed, to create a survey. There are some assumptions that we have to make about questionnaires or surveys, and as I indicated last week, statisticians like to have multiple terms for the same concept. Questionnaires and surveys are used interchangeably. There are some slight differences, but I'm not really that concerned with it. So whichever one you use, whichever one you're comfortable using, that's fine with me. The assumptions: we have to assume that people can read. We have to assume that they're willing and able, so that they want to, and that they'll complete the survey to the best of his or her ability. It's one of the most inexpensive ways to collect data, and it's also one of the easiest ways to collect a lot of data. So surveys are used quite a bit. The assumption about being able to complete to the best of their ability and willing and able, we as researchers have to help them be able to do that. So we have to be really explicit in our directions, leave nothing to interpretation, make sure that it's better to be explain things way too much than not enough, because you want everybody to complete the surveys the same way, or your data will be skewed. And what that means is that it won't be accurate because everyone's completing the survey differently because they had to make assumptions. As usual, I apologize for dog nails clicking in the background, and if cats meow. Some basic guidelines. Usually questionnaires or surveys are anonymous. It's one of the best features about them, and they're easy to be anonymous. Anonymous, of course, means that there are no identifying data connected with the survey, so you cannot determine who filled it out. Sometimes it's necessary to collect some identifying data, and in that case, we would, as researchers, make sure that the data is confidential. And that means that there is some type of identifying data attached to the surveys, but only you will see it, or you will code it. You'll keep the surveys locked up, etc., etc. So anonymity, confidentiality, not the same thing. It is important to know the difference between them. We will talk about the types of survey questions in a moment. And the only thing I want to say about survey construction or question construction, remember each survey question is referred to as an item also. And each item becomes a variable in the data set that you will use to analyze the data. I just want to make it clear that it's difficult to create a survey. It seems like the easiest thing to do from the beginning. You just create some questions, people answer them, blah, blah, blah. But because of the clarity issue, meaning is very clear to every single person that's filling it out, and because of other issues that we'll discuss in a moment, survey construction is actually very difficult. Researchers spend years, sometimes decades, perfecting an instrument because it is so difficult. So just know that going into it. It's not that laying it out initially is very difficult, but if you were wanting to use that and create a measure that is one of the best used to measure a concept, you'd be working on it forever. Luckily, you have good old me that'll help you edit your work. So some factors we have to consider first. Who is going to be answering the questions? We are down to 5 weeks of this class now, so we don't have a whole lot of time. And I've had a couple of you send me questions about who can be the participants. Really, for the purposes of this class, for your project, you need to have 25 people, but they can be friends, they can be colleagues, they can be anyone. And yes, you can create a Facebook group specifically for the purposes of this class and have those people fill out the survey. You just have to have 25 people do it. Most people, and I realize that's a convenient sample or maybe even a snowball type of sample, and it's, as I indicated last week, it's not going to be a probability sample. So we have talked about who will be answering the questions, how much time they'll be willing to spend. Most people, when they're doing a favor for you like this, are not willing to spend much more than 10 minutes. And even that might be a lot. So you don't want to ask lengthy questions, and you want to have people pilot it for you so you can have a spouse or a family member test it out for you to see how long it takes. It's hard for you to know to test yourself because you're biased, you know the survey. So just keep that in mind. How much is known about the range of possible answers? You would turn to the literature for that. You would do some research on it. And that's where you will help to develop your own questions. So you'll look at the kinds of questions that other people that have studied the same topic have asked. Logistics, typically in the past it's been a paper type of survey, but I'm sure most of you will, well, I don't know. I mean, you still could use a paper survey, but a lot of people now are turning to online surveys, or even having survey questions built into an email and have people answer it that way. The only issue with the email, of course, is that it isn't anonymous. So if you can use software online, and you guys all as EIU students have access to online survey software called Qualtrics, Qualtrics. If you go to the EIU main page and type Qualtrics in the search box, it'll bring up the screen where you can log in. And from there, just play with it a bit. It's not super difficult to learn how to use, but like any online survey software, it has its moments, so you do have to spend a little bit of time. There's always tutorials. You can search how to do things, and there's even a place where you can ask the person who, I don't even know who it is. Somebody answers questions about Qualtrics. I know when I ask a question, I usually have an answer within 24 hours. So you can do that too, but know that it's not an instant response. I'm able to answer some things. I do use Qualtrics, but I'm certainly not an expert on it. I just use it basically. But you could always check with me if you wanted to. We don't really use a cover letter when we do an online survey, but the very first screen that participants should see should contain information about why the study is being conducted, how the data will be used. It should contain my information, my contact information, because you're doing this for the purposes of a graduate class. Have some directions about how to fill it out and how long it'll be available, etc. And like I said, pilot test. I can't emphasize that enough. Make sure that other people can follow your directions. We've talked a little bit about some of the advantages. So they're easy, they're cheap, you can get at large samples, they can be anonymous. Most people are familiar with surveys too, they understand the nature of them. And it does allow us to have quantitative data for analysis. Disadvantages, not everyone likes doing it, so there can be a low response rate. You have to have people that can read. They're hard to create. Hard to write means they're hard to create. And the data is quantitative, which can be a disadvantage because we don't have a lot of information about the why with quantitative data. But for the purposes of this class, that's what we're going to do. Okay, some terminology. Items we've talked about. So questions or statements on the survey are actually referred to as items. The response rate is how many people you actually send out, say 100 surveys, 43 people return them, and so you would divide 43 by 100, so the number you get back divided by the number you sent out, and move the decimal point 2 points, and you have the percent that is considered the response rate. So in the example I just gave, you'd have a 43% response rate. Generally, you want at least 50% or better, but sometimes that can be hard to do. The response structure, so there's different ways that people can respond. It can be a Likert type scale, it can be yes or no. With online survey software, you can even, like, they have scales that you slide the cursor or the mouse to indicate where or how much. The layout, this was more with the paper surveys, like how it looked. You definitely don't want the layout to be overly crowded, because that can put people off and it seems overwhelming. The length. Okay, so the length refers to not only the length of the survey, but also the item. You don't want it to be too lengthy. Oftentimes, if an individual item is too lengthy, it's because it's more than one question, and in that case, you'd break it up. Filter items refer to questions that help you get at the target audience that you desire. So let's say you're looking only to survey males. Your filter item would be gender, and then you would take only the surveys. You could give the survey to anyone, but you'd only analyze the ones that had checked male. Cross-check items, don't really have to worry about that for your survey in class, but you should know what that means. You will sometimes ask more than one question in different ways to make sure that people are answering honestly, and that the data is accurate. So you might say, what year were you born, in one part of the survey, and then in another section you might ask for their age, and then you could compare the two. Ones that are not consistent, you wouldn't use. Okay, some item bias. So these are things we want to avoid, and these are important. I will be looking for these on your own surveys, because you don't want to have this issue because people won't fill it out consistently in the same manner. You don't want things to be ambiguous, so every item has to be perfectly clear. That can sometimes seem ridiculous, but that's how it has to be done. You cannot leave anything to participant interpretation. You must spell out exactly what you are looking for from each participant. A non-exhaustive response set, if you have an exhaustive response set, it means you have every single possible answer. I'm sure as I say that, you're thinking, how on earth could you even do that? Well, you really can't, unless something, I don't know, unless it's like yes or no, I mean, obviously. But so what we do is we'll have an other, and so they can indicate, usually you have a place where they can write an answer if they indicate other, so that you're aware of what that response is. We also sometimes do NA for not applicable, so that sometimes is added. But you want to give people a chance. If you're going to give a list and they have to answer, and they only can answer one thing, usually that's what you want, is just one choice. Give them another just in case. Otherwise, you're forcing them into a response, and it may not be applicable to them, but because there was no other, they had to select it. Rank lists, anything more than 3 you want to avoid. So like your top 3 choices for movies, or your top 3 books, or top 3 ways to study. If you ask people to rank, let's say 10 items, research shows that when they get to number 4, 5, 6, there really is no feeling, attachment to it, and so it's not entirely accurate. They're just putting numbers because they're being forced to. So let's say you had 10 things and said, put them in rank order. Really only the first 3 are going to matter. So try to avoid doing more than 3. Gender bias. This is important when you're writing your survey questions, especially in today's society. I'm sure that you're familiar with the Caitlyn Jenner issue that's hot in our society right now. Transgender individuals, oftentimes you want to be careful how you write items so that you don't alienate anyone, including transgender individuals. The way that I do that, I just try to put they. I don't ever put, let's say, when I collect data on relationship violence, I don't say, when the man uses violence, I say partner. Has your partner ever become violent towards you? That can be used or answered by any gender identity, so there's no bias there. So just be careful how you write items. I will be looking at this too when I look at your survey. Social favorability, loaded terms, leading questions. You want to be very careful how you ask questions. You don't want to give away what you're looking for in the question. So, for example, you wouldn't write a question like this. Pot is a bad drug. Are you in favor of making it legal? Well, you just gave the answer pretty much. You want them to say no. And it's a leading question because you already said pot is bad. Loaded terms are, of course, hot terms. You want to try to avoid them if you can. Transgender, homosexuality, those could be hot terms right now. And if you can, avoid using terminology that's going to set somebody off. And you usually know what those are. So you want to ask questions, but don't lead people or give away what you're looking for as a researcher. Unfamiliar terms and jargon, don't use them. A lot of times in FCS we throw around acronyms like we'll use SES for socioeconomic scale. And even whether it's an acronym or even that term, a lot of people don't know what it means. So you might ask people, what their income is or what their occupation is, but you wouldn't say, where are you in the SES scale? They would have no idea. Requiring information that they couldn't possibly have access to. This is really a problem when people are surveying children. They might ask them how much money their parents make, and the kids don't typically know. As they get older, they might know, but if they're in junior high, they don't necessarily have a clue. Also asking people, what's the population of your town, and how many of those people are living in poverty? The average person doesn't know that information, so you wouldn't ask that. That would be up to you as the researcher to find out on your own through other manners. Multidimensionality and compound items are very similar, which is why I've put them in the same bullet. Mainly what that means is that you're asking more than one question within a question. So you might say, has your partner ever kicked you, punched you, or used a weapon against you? Okay, so which question did you want me to answer? The first one, the second, or the third? And that can be confusing, and sometimes it can lead to skewed data. So somebody might have been punched, but they hadn't been kicked or had a weapon used against them, and so they might say no, because 2 of the 3 are no, when that's not really accurate, because they have been punched, and now the data's skewed. Hopefully that makes sense. So you try to only ask one question. Recall items, you want to try to avoid them as much as possible, but sometimes that isn't possible, depending on the nature of your research. This is when you're asking people to recall something that happened in the past. And of course, the further back you go, the more opportunities for inaccurate information. So it's okay to ask somebody, did your parents ever use spanking as a discipline form with you? Okay, and generally people recall that information, but you wouldn't say, when you were 3 years old, how often did your parents use timeout? Excuse me. That might be difficult to recall. And the more specific it is, the more difficult it is to access. So if you're asking general questions about the past, that's okay, but don't get too specific. Poor grammar, if you're using poor grammar in a survey, it's going to turn people off. I'm sure as teachers that is not news to you. Teachers are notorious for being irritated by poor grammar. So if there are mistakes, we try to catch them before your participants ever see the survey, because that'll put them off. They'll think, oh, this person can't even write. How are they going to do research? They won't take it seriously. They may not even fill it out. And then hypothetical items, you try to avoid these as well, but sometimes you have to use them. For example, you can't have somebody get beaten up by a mugger and then ask them how they felt about that experience. That would be unethical. However, you could say, pretend that you have been mugged 3 a.m. and this person beat you up in the process. How do you think you would feel about that? The problem with that is that most people tend to think they'll do something differently than they'll actually do in the situation. So somebody might say, well, I would kick butt and call the police, when really what they might do is just curl up in a ball, cry, and just go home. We don't know. So you have to use those kind of items with caution. And the way that you do that is by adding a warning or a caveat in your limitations or in the survey. In the findings, saying hypothetical items were used. We realize that there's a chance people might not act this way, but that's the only ethical way to collect data on this topic. So connecting the research questions to the hypotheses or to your general research questions for the project. You have to make sure that you can actually measure what you need to measure. And this is, I wouldn't say it's a huge issue, but it is one of the things that I tend to run into in this class. Somebody will come up with 3 research questions or hypotheses, and then they turn in a survey with 15 items. And one of the questions they haven't even asked, one of their research questions, they haven't included anything on the survey that would allow them to answer it. And that's where I come in. I can help edit and add, make suggestions. So when we're in a face-to-face class, I might say, when people are read to as children, they're more likely to enjoy reading as adults. Well, what kind of questions do you have to ask to test that? Clearly, you have to ask if they were read to as children. And you might ask what kinds of different situations they were read to. So they could have been read to by teachers, by parents, by babysitters, by siblings, by friends, etc. And then you would ask them how much they enjoy reading as adults, or how often they read for pleasure, blah, blah, blah. So you see, you would have to have all of those on there to answer that question. You couldn't just say, do you like reading? Because you can't connect that to being read to as children. Hopefully that makes sense. Defining concepts, you just have to be clear about any terms and concepts on your survey, so you can define them in advance before they start answering questions. So you might, in your mind, exercising on a regular basis might mean exercising daily for at least 60 minutes. To somebody else, exercising on a regular basis might mean 3 times a week for at least 30 minutes. To someone else, it might just mean doing housework and making sure you move around. So it could be a very different concept for different people. For your own research, you just have to define what you mean by that, so that everyone is clear going into it. Same with like infidelity, debt, gambling, relationship violence. Just define it. It's better to define it and seem like you're overcompensating than it is to leave something up to chance or something ambiguous. Some principles for creating effective questionnaires. Establish your research questions so that you have a goal. Give your questionnaire or your survey a title. It can even be your last name if you wanted to. But don't just throw something out there. Do give it a title. Include an explanation that explains why you're doing this, your contact information as well as my own. When using acronyms, always spell out the entire name, the first reference you use, and then you can put the acronym in parentheses for further or subsequent citations. You have to assume that not everybody knows what FCS means. And I'm confident you run into that issue if you say you're an FCS teacher and they'll look at you like, what? So just be clear. Questions should be relevant to whatever it is you're studying. They should be as short as possible. First, questions should try to engage the interest of the participants. The very first things you'll ask, of course, will be demographic items. So you're going to want to know age, gender, race, ethnicity, anything relevant to help you interpret the findings. We call that demographic information. And then the very first questions you ask for the survey shouldn't be super boring. You should try to get them to be interested in whatever it is you're studying. If you have to break up sections, you're changing focus, you want to do that with like bold text, or a line or something, or a new block if you're using online survey software, something that separates the two so they know, okay, we're mentally switching gears. Be aware of cultural factors. If you do have a target audience that is a cultural minority, or ethnic minority, or any type of minority, could be a sexual minority, or I don't know, anything that you think the target audience is going to be sensitive to the wording, then you want to be careful in your survey not to use terminology that is offensive. So, for example, when referring to somebody with a developmental disability, you put the person first and use person first language and say an adult with a developmental disability or a child with a developmental disability. You don't say a disabled child or a disabled adult. And so you want to make sure that you're up on that, and you may have to do some research to make sure. So just double check that. You don't want to upset people. You don't want to upset the parents of children with disabilities by using the wrong kind of language. So not only be aware, but you have to be up to date. Reverse items if you have to ask a question. Let's say they're doing a Likert scale, and 5 is typically ranked as a positive ranking or rating. Sometimes people will throw in an item that reverses that, and they'll make 1 the positive ranking to see if people are really paying attention to what they're filling out. And then when you go to score that for the analysis, you have to be careful to remember, wait, there's reverse items here. You don't have to use those. People do use them when they're conducting an actual study, whether they want to get it published or presented somewhere, but you don't have to worry about that. You should just know what it is. Anything sensitive should be in the middle or the end of the survey. If you're asking about incest, for example, you want to ask towards the end, not immediately. Minimize the use of skip rules if you can, like if you answer yes to this, skip to question 18. Only because it can be confusing. You can actually set up the online software to do that for you. So if you do that, that's fine, but just avoid making the participant have to think, okay, where do I go next? Make sure everything looks professional, uncluttered, and attractive, even online. You shouldn't be changing font, size, type, whatever. Make it easy. Number your questions. People take them more seriously when they are numbered. It's not like it really matters because you control the code book in the end, but do number your questions so people feel like it is looking professional. Make sure your instructions stand out clearly. Put them in all caps, bold, different color, or a bigger font. Leave plenty of room in an open-ended question. You can control that in an online survey by creating a text box. If you're using paper surveys, you want to make sure that you leave enough room because some people write really big. How will they be distributed? How will they get back to you? How will you ensure they're anonymous? What's an acceptable response rate? Will your design require a follow-up? For the purposes of this class, how they'll be distributed is typically online, and that's how they'll get it back to you. You'll get the data online yourself. Usually it's anonymous if you're doing online. An acceptable response rate is as long as you get 25 people, that's acceptable. If your design did require a follow-up, you'd have to think about how you're going to match participant responses. But for this class, that's not going to happen. You don't have enough time. Okay, and that concludes this lecture. If you have questions, let me know.